the wide open plains where the wind carried the whispers of old tales and the mountains stood tall like silent guardians. A cowboy lived in solitude. His name was known to few, and remembered by even fewer, for he kept to himself, and his horse was his only true companion. He built his cabin with his own hands, a strong log structure at the edge of the prairie, where the land stretched forever, and the sky seemed endless. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the land in a golden glow, the cowboy rode back from tending his cattle when he spotted movement near the rocky edge of a shallow ravine. He urged his horse closer, and what he found made his breath tighten in his chest. 2 young native women lay injured, their dresses torn and dust covering their faces. One clutched her leg while the other seemed to struggle to breathe. Without hesitation, he climbed down his horse and examined them, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. He could tell they had been attacked, maybe by bandits or thrown from frightened horses. Either way, they could not survive out there alone. He lifted the first girl carefully in his arms, her weight light against his strong frame, then returned for the second, who leaned weakly against him, her head resting against his chest. He mounted his horse with both of them balanced carefully and made his way back to the cabin. Each step of the horse, deliberate, steady. The women moaned softly in pain, but he whispered words of comfort. Though they did not understand his language, the tone carried a promise of safety. At the cabin, he laid them on his bed and tended to their wounds as best as he could. His supplies were meager, but he had learned enough from trail injuries to stop the bleeding and wrap their bruises. He gave them water in a tin cup and brewed herbs he had gathered for pain relief through the night. He kept watch, not daring to rest, the crackle of the fire filling the silence while the moon bathed the land in silver. By morning, one of the women stirred her eyes opening to study the stranger. She saw his worn hat resting on the table, his revolver lying beside it, but his posture was calm. He sat by the fire, sharpening his knife with slow patience. She spoke a few words in her tongue, but he shook his head gently, unable to answer. Still, he gave her water and gestured for her to rest again. She seemed to understand his intention was not harm. Days passed. The women slowly regained strength. He made soup from wild game and roots, shared his bread, though he often went hungry himself so they could eat. He mended their dresses with rough stitches, and when they tried to rise too early, he guided them back to the bed with steady hands, his eyes holding firm kindness. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire cast flickering shadows, the older of the 2 sisters tried to speak with gestures. She pointed to her heart, then to him, then to the horizon, and finally raised her hands like wings. He did not fully grasp her meaning, but he nodded quietly, perhaps understanding that she wished to tell him of her people and their gratitude. On the 5th day, riders appeared on the horizon, proud figures on painted horses, their long braids flowing. With the wind among them was an elder, his presence commanding the respect of all, his silver hair tied in braids, his face lined with the wisdom of many winters. The cowboy stepped outside his cabin as they arrived, his revolver still on his belt, but his hands resting calmly at his sides. The 2 women rushed to the elder, crying out in their language. He embraced them both, relief flooding his face. He looked then to the cowboy, his sharp eyes taking in the man who had sheltered his daughters. The silence stretched between them, heavy with meaning. The elder finally stepped forward, placing a hand on his chest and bowing his head slightly. The cowboy nodded, returning the gesture, though he did not speak. The elder then raised his hand and gave a sharp whistle. A great eagle swooped down from the sky, circling above before landing on a post beside him. The bird spread its wings, majestic and powerful, a symbol of their people. The elder spoke words in his language, his voice low and deep. The daughters translated brokenly, saying their father wished to honor the man who had saved their lives. The elder reached into a pouch at his side and drew out a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. He placed it in the cowboy's hands. Inside was a feather, black, tipped with white, bound with red thread. The daughter explained it was a sacred gift, a symbol of courage and spirit, given only to those who showed true honor. The cowboy looked at the feather, then at the elder. Though words failed him, His eyes spoke his gratitude. He tucked the feather carefully into his hat band where it rested proudly, catching the sunlight like a flame. The elder and his people stayed through the night sharing food and stories around the fire. The cowboy listened, though he could not understand every word. The laughter, the songs, the rhythm of the drum touched something deep within him. He realized that though their lives were different, their hearts carried the same love for family and land. When morning came, the women were strong enough to ride again. The elder prepared to leave, but before departing, he placed his hand firmly on the cowboy's shoulder, his eyes meeting his with unspoken respect. The cowboy nodded once more, watching as the group rode into the distance, their figures blending with the horizon. Left alone again in the quiet cabin, the cowboy sat on the porch, his hand resting lightly on the brim of his hat, where the sacred feather now lived. He gazed out over the endless plains and felt something he had not known in years, a sense of belonging not just to the land but to the stories and people who had touched his life. Though he remained a solitary rider from that day forward, he was no longer just a cowboy in the eyes of the prairie. He was the man who carried 2 daughters of a chief to safety, and in return carried with him a gift beyond measure, a bond of respect that would echo in the winds of the plains for generations to come.